Hello there, and welcome to the map screen, where we take a look at the design and function of maps in video games through a cartographic lens. In this episode, we'll be looking at another classic title, Super Mario World. Released regionally between 1990 and 1992 as a pack-in launch title for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Mario series is one that needs no introduction, being one of the most recognizable properties in the world today. The game marked the sixth entry in the series, following up on the original Super Mario Bros., two regional iterations of Super Mario Bros. 2, with both the Lost Levels and Super Mario Bros. USA, and Super Mario Bros. 3, all released for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. There was also Super Mario Land, released just a year earlier for the Game Boy. With the exception of Super Mario Bros. 3, these early games in the series were entirely linear affairs, stringing players along from one level to the next in a predetermined order, secret warp zones notwithstanding. Super Mario Bros. 3 was the first to feature a map screen in between levels, often referred to as an overworld, and mechanically speaking, the maps in this game were arguably more ambitious and varied than what would come later in Super Mario World, with dynamic features like roaming airships and patrolling enemies, and items which could directly interact with the overworld. This added a new element of player choice of the game, allowing players to skip certain levels or go out of their way to visit points of interest, like Toad Houses, where players could get extra power-ups. But the overall progression was still relatively linear outside of these small forks, and the game was broken up across 8 disparate world maps, which had no clear connection between them. There was also no way for players to return to a previous map once completed without restarting the entire game. This use of multiple smaller maps, rather than one large game world, was likely due, at least in part, to the limited 8-bit architecture of the original Nintendo Entertainment System. But Super Mario World had the benefit of the newer Super Nintendo console, with its more powerful 16-bit hardware, allowing the game to iterate and expand on this idea of player choice by packing its new world, Dinosaur Island, with an even greater number of secrets, alternative paths, and hidden levels. And while the map could be considered simplified from the previous game in some ways, it is generally considered the more well-known and iconic of the two overworlds. But how did the inclusion of maps in these two games improve the Super Mario formula? Why include an overworld between levels in lieu of simply transporting players from the end of one to the beginning of the next, as earlier titles did? Conceptually, the maps introduced a thematic framing around the game's levels, and what was previously just a series of disconnected vignettes now had a defined shape with stronger spatial continuity. This brought a greater sense of scope and progress to the player's journey. And even though there are still some smaller subset maps that are separate from the main overworld, areas like Vanilla Dome and the Forest of Illusion, you can still see exactly where these places fit into the broader geography of the island. From a gameplay standpoint, one of the development goals for Super Mario World was to provide players with a more replayable experience. Super Mario Bros. 3 dabbled in the idea with its alternate paths, but the developers wanted Super Mario World to push the idea even further. Of the 74 levels in the game, 24 include secret exits, which give players an alternative way to finish the level. Upon finding one, a new path would be blazed across the overworld, leading to new areas or ways to bypass particularly challenging levels. Some of these secret exits are even required to progress through the game's main path, for example in the Forest of Illusion, which will block players' progress until they find the correct secret exit among its many levels. Additionally, there was the introduction of the new dotted line blocks, which were Nintendo's alternative to having traditional difficulty modes in the game. These could be activated by large, hidden switch blocks found across the world, which would make later levels in the game easier to complete. But the location of these blocks could take some trial and error to find, and often meant that players had to return to past areas in search of them. Players are even encouraged at one point to go back and find these switches if they haven't already. So with the new expectation that players would want to revisit levels in search of new secrets, or even just to stock up on items and extra lives, the Overworld map provided a fun and elegant substitute to a traditional menu as a level select, helping to make this new replayable design approach a much more engaging and immersive experience. The look of the map is lifted directly from the main levels of the game, using a similar visual language and assets. The world feels alive with animated landforms like Mario's iconic hills with eyes, drifting clouds, and rolling waves. Miniature Boo ghosts hover about their haunted houses, and crystal gems glitter in the dark caves of Vanilla Dome. These tiny details further support the immersive experience, and blur the line between a living, breathing place and the static navigational aids we typically think of with maps. But the overworld also follows the most basic principles of a map, such as the need for generalization. The paths between stages are simplified and straightened, objects are out of scale with one another, and basic markers serve as shorthand for interesting locations. It almost lifts the diagrammatic layout of something like a transit map, particularly the kind inspired by Harry Beck's iconic London Tube map, of which some variation can now be found for just about every major public transportation system in the world. In these maps, routes are restricted to a grid with limited angles, abandoning geographical accuracy in favor of readability with clearly marked stops. Likewise, the routes in Super Mario World are mostly at right angles to one another, with the occasional quarter circle curve easing a change of direction between markers. Its paths are also clear and easy to see, while still feeling like a natural part of the world. You might also describe the overworld as board game-like, with Mario restricted to traveling or pausing over predetermined spaces. Classic games like Candyland or Life, which have been around for decades by this point, offer similar paths to players. No doubt the resemblance between Super Mario World's overworld and traditional board games came up again during development for the later Mario Party series of games. But in addition to structure and immersion, the map provides useful information. Different markers are used to show the location of levels or stages. Red dots indicate that there are multiple exits in the level, and that a new branching path on the overworld can be unlocked there, while yellow dots indicate levels with only one exit. There are also different sizes for these markers, though there doesn't appear to be a consensus on what these actually represent. Some have suggested the size refers to the length of the level, while others say that they show where there's a major fork in the road. But the large yellow marker for Vanilla World 3 appears to defy all logic, and ultimately, only Nintendo may know the answer. We also get additional context from the position of markers. For example, the ones resting in water are appropriately water-based levels, letting the player know ahead of time what is in store for them. There are also unique markers for castles, ghost houses, and underground stages, which have this really nice glowing detail on the rocks around their tunnels. Ultimately, the introduction of a world map to the Super Mario series was generally lauded by both critics and players alike. It would not only become a staple of the series going forward, but inspired the use of overworlds in other platforming games, with another great example being Donkey Kong Country. But that's a map for another video. So what do you think of the map in Super Mario World? Do you prefer it over the maps in Super Mario Bros. 3, or do you see it as a backstep? What are some of your other favorite platformers to make use of an overworld map? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.